Hello and welcome to IPSE Live. Ahead of next year's general election, self-employment is high on the political agenda. And IPSE has recently launched its manifesto outlining some groundbreaking policies to support independent professionals. In today's episode, we take a look at the proposals in the manifesto and discuss how they would help the self-employed with Dan Martin, editor of businesszone.co.uk, Duncan O'Leary, Research Director at Demos, and George Anastasi, Policy Development Manager at IPSE and one of the authors of the report. If you have any questions for the panel or comments on the manifesto, you can get in touch with us on Twitter using the hashtag IPSE Live, that's IPSE Live. George, I'll start with you. You've just got back from attending all the party conferences. Can you describe the buzz around self-employment there?
So it was quite an interesting party conference season. Because the numbers of self-employed have risen so dramatically, it was on the agenda at all three. Particularly at the Labour Party conference, where Ed Miliband actually mentioned the speech. At the other two, it was mainly on the fringes, so a number of events hosted by organisations like IPSE go on around the main conference. And at each of those, MPs, laws, etc., talk on various subjects, and self-employment was one of the ones that got a lot of attendees and a lot of interest.
Duncan, you published a report on freelancing in August, which helped to guide the IPSE manifesto. Can you take us through the key findings in that, the main things that you found, coming from from a think tank who sort of looks at lots of different issues? What were the key things you found coming in?
Well, there's been a big debate over the last 18 months or so about what's been driving the big increases in the number of people who are self-employed in the UK. And I think that debate is starting to settle down now. The evidence suggests around 3/4 of those who are self-employed say that that's their preferred way of working. So that suggests we're seeing a structural shift in the labour market towards more self-employment. We wanted to understand the policy implications of that and think them through. So we looked at areas like regulation and how to simplify that, make life easier for those who want to be self-employed, but also make sure that those who are owed employment rights get them. So we did some thinking about how to simplify how the government establishes your employment status. We also looked at business-to-business relationships. Late payments are obviously a big issue for the self-employed, but also how to resolve contractual disputes with larger organisations. We looked at some ideas from Australia, for example, about new models of arbitration that make it cheaper to settle those disputes. And we also looked at how the self-employed can protect their living standards in the long run. So issues around pensions as well, the self-employed much less likely to have a personal pension than employees, for example.
I suppose, looking at the party conferences we had, Ed Miliband mentioned the self-employed, or thanked the self-employed in his leader's address. Dan, you're obviously your brief at business owners in general. How do you see that? The self-employment has sort of got that kind of recognition in the leader's speech for the Labour Party. And do you think that's sort of an unfair highlight of that specific area of business? Do you think it's fair? Do you think that sort of fits?
It does. I mean, the Ed Miliband thing was interesting. Still yet to hear about what he means about extending the rights for the self-employed. Right. That's all he said, and I've tried to find out what he means. But I think it was good that it was in there. I mean, my website is a website for small businesses generally, but in the last year or so, I've started to use the word self-employed, freelance a lot more, because we've seen an increase in freelancers and self-employed joining us. So whereas previously it would have been, small businesses with a couple of staff, now we're getting a lot more one-man, one-woman bands joining it. I think it's great, and it's just a reflection of the economy. So I think it's even making journalists who write about business think a bit differently about actually who their audience are. So articles we write targeting small businesses, there are implications for the self-employed and freelancers. So I think all this talk around it is brilliant, but we need to obviously make sure they're supported properly.
Well, what do you think that you sort of mentioned that there's a bit of a shift there? Do you think that's because of the way people set up businesses now? I mean, whereas do you think that's changed and more people can sort of go into it as a self-employed person and grow? Do you think that's a newer thing?
It's all about the internet. It's all about, it costs you nothing to start a business, apart from, if you want to, whatever status you take, it might cost you a bit of money. But, basically now it can be a Twitter account and a WordPress blog. So, yeah, I think that's what it is. But obviously the self-employed and don't necessarily see themselves as business owners or entrepreneurs. Yeah. So that's why the wording is, you've got to be careful about the wording. But I think there's a lot to do with the ease of doing stuff on the side, freelance or getting on people per hour or getting on eBay. It's a lot to do with the internet, and now it's sort of levelled the playing field when it comes to startup costs.
I suppose that creates, I mean, for you, George, that creates a different set of policies, whereas previously there was a lot about access to finance. You know, there's been various government schemes about getting sort of low-cost loans and access to finance for people that want to set up a business. But if the cost isn't there, then maybe that evolution evolves away from that and more into sort of rather than financing it. Is that sort of what you found?
So we've actually devoted a whole chapter to starting out in the manifesto and come up with a range of starting out. Finance is one, but it's not the key issue, particularly for the self-employed, because as you say, the costs of starting out, I think, damaged are quite low. The real issues relate to the new groups of people starting to be self-employed. So increasingly we're seeing young graduates immediately turn to self-employment, and they need a quite unique set of help as compared to those who might be established coming out of traditional employment with an existing client base. They'll need mentoring, advice, access to kind of help on how to set their businesses up in terms of all the regulatory requirements. And also you look at groups like women and mothers who kind of find self-employment a useful option. Again, there's a unique set of policies needed there as well. And our manifesto goes into quite a lot of detail about what we can do to help those people.
Well, that's interesting because you're looking at sort of the mothers, or parents in general, actually, the things that they have. Then you're getting more into the stuff that you mentioned in your report on rights. And obviously rights is when it comes to self-employed people, because for a lot of people, if you do go self-employed, you give up, or you're seen as having given up access to rights. But there's quite a lot in the manifesto about certain areas like maternity pay, paternity pay, things like that. I mean, do you think that now more people are doing it, those rights are starting to come back in, or do you think, once you go, that's it, you forsake all that and you're out there on your own? I mean, how have you found it?
Well, I think there are some obvious areas where there needs to be a more level playing field between employees and the self-employed. One that I'd highlight in particular is spending on training. So if you train, if you're an employer and you spend money training your employees, as long as that training is relevant to your business, that's tax deductible. If you're self-employed and you invest in your own skills, if you're learning something new, that's not tax deductible. So you don't have the same rules applying to the employees and the self-employed, and that makes it harder for people to branch into new areas of business, to be flexible, to be entrepreneurial, which are all the things that government says it wants people to. So that's one area I think we're likely to see some change in the next couple of years.
Well, that's interesting, I suppose, because I mean, Dan, you're saying you have more different people coming to your site looking for different things. There's barriers there then to creating that kind of portfolio career. So having lots of different skill sets and expanding your skill set. Is that something that, are you seeing that? Are people complaining to you? Is that what you're seeing out there?
Yeah, they are, but so the site that I run, I also run another site called UK Business Forums. Bit of a plug there, I know, but it is relevant. Which is a massive community of small business owners. So all the content is just questions and answers. Okay. So the savvy self-employed and entrepreneurs, whatever we're calling them, are getting the peer-to-peer advice. A lot of them don't think about the government support. To be honest, they hear the word government support and go, I don't want to touch that. So there is a lot more, again, with the internet, of like peer-to-peer sharing going on and sharing skills and Google Hangouts and all sorts of online training. But I bet if you did say to them, the government will give you a tax break to go and get professional training, they'd not turn it down. But it's the savvy ones that are using the free stuff that's out there and the learning from each other.
Open source training.
That's sort of what we're saying. And what's the thing, MOOCs nowadays, which is like online training. And there's a lot of that kind of. There is a lot of stuff out there that you can do it yourself.
You're saying it's more skill set based than qualification. Yeah. As long as you can do the job and you've got the skills, you don't need the certification. Well, it's interesting you say they're less interested in what the government can do, because one of the key things in the manifesto is to actually appoint a minister for self-employment, and you think it's about the right time to be doing that.
Definitely. I mean, you're probably aware that self-employed are numbering almost 5 million, and they're set to overtake the public sector in terms of raw numbers by early 2016. So with I think the time's right for somebody in government exclusively responsible who's going to speak for them and represent them. And hopefully a minister for self-employment is an easily implementable policy. We think the next government should do it. They can speak on the behalf of the self-employed and look after them within the Department for Business, because the needs of the self-employed are different to those of larger businesses. They have different needs. They're not the same as, say, you talk about SMEs. It could be somebody with 1 employee or somebody with 50. There's a real difference between groups.
For
There
SMEs,
is already
so
a minister for SMEs, but a separate minister exclusively responsible for the self-employed would be in our view, a very positive step forward to recognising this group of people.
And do you think, I mean, Duncan, I'm assuming you agree with that as a kind of, as a catch-all sort of way of making sure all the various different policies are implemented?
I think it's something I could definitely see happening in the next government. I think you can see the parties, as Ed Miliband's speech indicated, thinking about how to reach out to a growing portion of the workforce, but also, of course, the electorate as well. 1 in 7 of the workforce are now self-employed. So I think that's the kind of together different structures in Whitehall to work together more effectively. Because of course this is one of those agendas that crosses government departments, as well as sometimes having someone who's responsible for knitting together those different policy agendas can be very helpful.
I mean, we talked a little bit about Ed Miliband mentioning self-employed people specifically. All the other parties mentioned it in one way or another, but I think that the Labour Party gave it the most focus. Do you think, not traditionally being the sort of the party of small business or the party of business in general, that label being given to the Conservatives, 6 months out from a general election, who in your view is leading that sort of race for the self-employed vote?
I think it's very open at the moment. Ed Miliband's obviously made his pitch for it, but I think the current government's done some really good things in certain areas, in particular opening up public procurements, for example, to a much greater degree than the past to smaller businesses and the self-employed. There's a small business bill coming up in the next well. So I think you can see all sides making that pitch. Labour, of course, see themselves as a party of labour, of work, and this is a large section of the workforce. So I think they're right to make their play for it, but I think they're going to need to offer a lot more detail about what they mean by equal rights.
You've also got the fact that Labour's connection to the unions, the way we work is changing. It's one of the key points why we need this manifesto. Do you see a conflict there? Do you think Labour can both continue to work with the unions as it does and be the party of self-employment?
It's certainly caused a bit of a kind of existential crisis for them, in the sense that unions want to represent workers who work for a business, who are employees of a business. So it's difficult for them to represent the self-employed. However, Labour themselves have always been very open and very keen to represent the self-employed when we've had discussions with them. And with 5 million votes up for grabs, it's no surprise that all the main parties are very interested in trying to represent this group, although they may come at it from different angles. Obviously, with IPSE, we've talked to all 3 of the main parties and trying to get a sense of where they stand on this and trying to encourage them to adopt policies that are very positive for the self-employed. But I found Labour to be very open about it. I found the Conservatives to be the same, and the Liberal Democrats too. So I don't think you could say there's a clear front runner here. It's as Duncan says, very open. And as we get nearer the deadline, I think we'll see their positions on self-employment crystallise.
And I mean, Dan, for you, can you see one thing, one particular sort of play that any of the 3 or 4 could make now that would give them the sort of the upper hand? Is there one key sort of thing they could promise or do?
It's sort of getting out of the way, isn't it? Really, but with stuff like deregulation. So that's what that's what a lot of sort of self-employed people want. A lot of what small business owners want is less paperwork, less red tape, less hoops to jump through. So if one of the parties can convince the self-employed that they will do that with actual actions. So as that's said, we will wait what actually Ed Miliband meant by embracing the self-employed. So if he could crystallise exactly what that will mean, and it involves a lot of removal of red tape, then I think that would be the one thing that would swing the vote for the self-employed, I think. And
I'm assuming when you're talking about that red tape, the majority of that would exist in things like how they pay their tax and things like that. I mean, Manifesto, you've outlined some key sort of big changes that would need to be made, but quite clearly, quite clear roadmap to do those. I mean, you think that's sort of a key area?
Yeah, I mean, you're right to say that it's about government getting out of the way in a lot of places. There's a reason the subtitle to the manifesto is Unleashing Independent Professionals, where we're removing restraints on their growth. Tax is one area in which that's quite important that you mentioned. We've got some radical plans in there to simplify the tax system. For example, merging national insurance and income tax as our kind of longer term end goals. But there's also other regulatory barriers, including public procurement. So if a self-employed person wants to bid for a public contract, it's very difficult, either because the contract's far too big or because the requirements on bidding are very, very onerous. We've also got kind of regulatory issues with security clearance and things like that. There's all sorts of things the government can do to get out the way, and even in terms of helping the self-employed. So I mentioned earlier a mentoring scheme, especially for younger self-employed or new entrants to self-employment, would be very good. We wouldn't see the government being the leader of that. We'd see that being a business-led mentoring scheme with BIS, the Department for Business, administering that scheme. So we think support has to come from business, with the government taking a leadership role.
Just one point. One of the things in your report is about work hubs. That's one of the big things that that's, if I had to pick one thing, is the empty space that exists in cities is unbelievable, and a lot of it is public sector owned. And there's actually a government scheme that exists called Space for Growth, which is, I've been writing about government schemes for like 12 years, but it's probably one of the best schemes they've ever done, and hardly anybody knows about it. And they're just basically, the government's got all this office space and they want to give it a lot for free, or for like 10 quid a day, to people like the self-employed. But nobody knows about it. So that's often the problem with a lot of government stuff, is the good stuff is sort of hidden and it doesn't get out there. So I think opening up, because the self-employed are flexible, they need to be able to work from anywhere. Giving free space up, or very cheap space, that could be a major thing that the government could do for startups.
Do you think a lot of that can happen at a local level? Because we're talking about big government here, and I mean, a lot of the local councils have a remit for enterprise and a remit for that sort of thing, and they're looking for ideas. Do you think there's an opportunity to sort of work with for the local councils and that sort of thing?
Yes, I do. So there's government-owned buildings, but there are also derelict buildings that aren't being used properly. So one of the things we suggest is that local authorities should be mapping where those derelict buildings are, what the rateable value of them is for council tax. So more of the private sector can come in and create the kind of work hubs that people want to work in. I think one of the other things that local government could do would be to help settle some of those contractual disputes between small and large businesses. So in our report, we looked at a model in Australia where small business commissioners, which operate at a state level, arbitrate between large and small businesses for a small fee, $100, which is a lot cheaper than bringing lawyers into it and getting entangled into long-running disputes. So that's another thing that we thought could be done at a local level, probably by local economic partnerships.
I suppose, I mean, I'm interested in what you put in the manifesto about the repurposing of space. I mean, one of the main things is, people have been saying for ages that the high street is dead. People don't shop in the high street so much anymore. Those spaces are almost reserved. They're brilliant spaces for different types of enterprise, and exactly the sort of thing. I mean, is that an easy thing for councils and government to do, or is that?
So although the regulations are complex around this sort of thing, it wouldn't be an especially difficult change to make it easier for the rateable category that a premises has to change. So often a derelict shop can only be used for retail or for catering or whatever, and we think it should be easy to change that to, say, office space, which then makes it easier for it to become a work hub. Work hubs can be anything in size from 3 desks to 300, and we think that some of that empty space on the high street could serve a great purpose as being a local work hub space for local businesses, and that happens in a lot of rural areas. Certainly European money available for this as well, and it seems to us that to our policy team that there's something that can be done there.
Dan, do you think that's more of that's because the regulations hard to change, or is that a sort of an ideological problem with the way the councils are seeing that space, that they can't change it? I mean, is it just getting through to them, changing their mindsets?
Yeah, completely. In Bristol, where I live, right in the centre of the shopping area, there's this department store, 2-storey department store that probably closed about 18 months ago, and it's just been empty for 18 months. And it's probably owned by money, but they just can't, and maybe the council, but they just can't get their head around. Got to get a big corporate chain in. They can't get their head around, maybe we could actually turn the bottom floor into a workspace and the top floor to a pop-up shop. So yeah, I think there is a lot about changing the mindset. And there are some councillors, I know some people within the Bristol Council who are very entrepreneurial and would love to do that kind of stuff. but it's the people at the top that are saying no.
And you think the demand is there from self-employed people out there who want to work in those spaces?
Yeah,
you're queuing up to?
Yeah, you just got to look in coffee shops and anywhere that offers free Wi-Fi. You know, there's people that are sat there with one cup of coffee for hours, you know, who are desperate for somewhere to go. So if it was a proper with free Wi-Fi and opportunities to network, they're willing to pay a little bit for it. And obviously it benefits the high street as well, because those people are going to nip out and visit the shops that are there. You know, so it just looks awful having a load of empty shops. So why not, until it can be given to a retail chain, give it over to people that actually use it.
I mean, there are examples of this happening already. Westminster City Council have given up some of their empty space to be used as work hubs, and it's been really successful. Because a work hub isn't just a space to work, it's a community of like-minded individuals as well. And nothing benefits a self-employed more than talking to other people that do the same job as you, kind of learning from them, sharing your experiences, etc. And it's been a really positive space for encouraging entrepreneurialism.
And you just mentioned Wi-Fi, you know, connectivity of all types. I mean, like you said, you came from Bristol, where problems on the train. Anything like that.
Don't be started.
Anything like that causes, you know, self-employed people who are working from home or are travelling to client sites. You know, that causes huge problems if it doesn't work and it doesn't access in any type, causing them problems. That doesn't just affect self-employed people. You know, broadband especially, do you think there's more to be done in that area? Everyone complains about it, but is it possible to give everyone world-class broadband?
I think the government's made some quite positive moves towards it. There's a question about how ambitious they are in the future. So at the moment there's a policy which is around minimum speeds across the country. One of the things we talked about in the report is whether there should be a minimum ratio of speeds between urban and rural areas. So making sure that rural areas don't fall too far behind. The self-employed are more likely to live in rural areas than they are in urban areas, and even more likely than employees to be living in sparse areas as well, where there aren't many houses. So being able to connect to the rest of the country, the rest of the world, is incredibly important. And I think the travel issue that you mentioned is also important. In London, less than half of the tube stations have Wi-Fi, and there's no Wi-Fi between stations. You compare that to, say, the tram network in Edinburgh, where they're having Wi-Fi installed on every tram. There's a real difference. So I think we've got to be careful not to fall behind.
A big area of the manifesto is the stuff that's devoted to younger people. There are more younger people going into self-employment. It's one of the biggest growth areas, as you mentioned. If that's the case, is that because it's working well, or is that happening in spite of the fact that there isn't much happening in that area? I mean, do you think that's how do you see that?
So we should definitely start early with young people and have entrepreneurial education in schools, and also talk about self-employment as an option in career services at universities.
It's not currently.
It doesn't currently happen. There are a few vocational courses in which self-employment and kind of setting up your own business is discussed, but it's not widespread at all. And I think that would go a long way to helping businesses and kind of young people setting up their own businesses to be successful, because failure rates are still quite high for those businesses. So it doesn't happen enough, and it needs to happen more.
How do you see that happen? Do you see that as part of the careers advice? Do you see it on the curriculum as skills they learn? How do you see that?
I think careers advice is a big issue, actually. It's something that the responsibility for careers has been passed back to schools. I think that's a good thing. That when often as a school, when you're given a service by the local authority, it tends not to be the exact one you wanted. But I think schools need to have more of a reason to invest in proper careers advice, whether they're being held accountable for it through Ofsted inspections, or whether there's more data that shows you whether the kids that went to your school ended up in employment and so forth. And I think the problem we have at the moment is, unless it's invested in, it ends up being a member of staff who's just given the job, isn't necessarily equipped to do that job particularly well, probably went through quite a conventional route themselves, the academic path to university and then into a full-time job. So they don't necessarily have experience of vocational routes or self-employment. So I think, for me, getting careers advice right is a big thing for the next government of whatever shade.
And Dan, do you see that? You know, Duncan said, it's because a lot of the teachers teaching it don't have that experience. They're full of traditional routes. You see self-employed people going in and sort of talking to young people, or
yeah, that's key to it. I mean, it's just it's getting people in there who are willing to talk, and it's not it's about the positives and the negatives, because TV shows like Dragon's Den and The Apprentice and all that stuff potentially makes it look a lot easier than it is, or you can go on, have an idea and raise 100 grand. So there needs to be the reality check as well, but also the positives and how easy it is. And there's lots and lots of private schemes out there, like speakers in schools or business speakers in schools, I think it's called, of getting proper self-employed entrepreneurs just into the school and giving speeches and telling kids how to do it. And like you said about the mentoring, it shouldn't be the government that runs that. They should support it. So encouraging the private sector to get a bit more involved. And there'd be plenty of self-employed people who'd be willing, to go to a local school, for an hour a month and give a talk. There's loads of people that would be willing to do it. They just got to ask them.
Well, I think that occurred to me on the tube. You see the adverts for universities. So 70, 80, 90% of our leavers end up with a job. That's key. That's what people want when they go to university. So do you feel like is it possible that because of that, because universities are judged on, there's a reticence there to talk about self-employment because there's that the figures that they have are all based on the jobs people get when they leave. Is that a cultural mindset?
I think, if anything, universities aren't held accountable enough for whether people end up in jobs, whether that's a self-employed job or a working as an employee. But I think the key thing is that you get in people who have experience of different types of jobs, and they're exposed to the students who work there. So you have people who run their own business and employ others. You have people who are freelancers. You have people who are a lawyer and so forth. So people really do see the full spectrum of options available to them. And I think, as George said, I think there's a mentality among the generation who are leaving university now to be more positively disposed towards self-employment. So being aware of exactly what that entails, the pluses and the minuses, can only be a good thing.
I mean, to wrap up then, tricky question, but George, if you could have one of the policies from your manifesto implemented in May after the general election, which one would you go for?
It'd be the first one on the list, which is the Minister for Self-Employment, because if you do that, hopefully everything else would follow.
It's one that leads to the rest of them. Would you agree? Is there anything else in there that you'd see, you'd like to see more than all the others?
For me, one of the big things I think government should be pursuing is around pensions. So we know that the self-employed are less likely to have a pension and less likely to have less money in their pension as well. So I think having a tailored pension scheme for self-employed that gives you some flexibility to draw out some of your recent contributions would make people feel a lot more confident about putting money in, because they know they're completely locking money away that they may need in 6 months' time. So
flexibility, really.
So a pension scheme for self-employed, yeah.
Okay. Dan, anything else?
I'd agree with both of those, but I'd say the conciliation service for late payment that you've suggested, which for my members, and we all know it, for all our members and people, late payment is huge, but they're scared to deal with it. So I think I read that and thought the conciliation late payment, that could be a vote winner for whichever party wants to take your idea on.
And obviously we'd prefer to see all of them, I suppose.
Of course, and the work hubs.
That's two, you can have one. Okay, well that's all we've got time for today, so thank you for watching, and thanks to our panellists, Dan Martin, Duncan O'Leary and George Anastasi. To read the manifesto in full, go to ipse.co.uk, that's IPSE.co.uk. Thanks a lot, see you next time in November.